Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Z, and we are in World War One, and we're at part three. We're going to talk about the Eastern Front a little bit, the U.S. entry into the war, and of course, the end of the war as well. So, when we talk about the Eastern Front, we're not talking about trenches. Okay, the front itself is 1,000 miles north to south, and hundreds of miles east to west. So it's a long swath of territory that you see here. Okay, this is the furthest advance, right? Here's the front, one of the fronts, right? Here's the farthest advance. So we're looking at from like here to here and here to here. Wow, lots of territory. Okay. In this part of the war, it's a war of maneuver. Attackers would penetrate 50 or 60 miles before encountering any resistance. So fighting mainly happened between the Central Powers, Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. Later on, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire joined with the Central Powers, and Romania joined with Russia. Russia was poorly armed. Their factories could not keep up with munitions demands. There also were not enough roads to keep supplies flowing. And this, of course, is one of the major causes of the Russian Revolution itself. Austria-Hungary's army was staffed by people who came from the provinces and who wanted independence. So morale and loyalty were low on their side. The German army was trained to fight a war of maneuver. And they also had good infrastructure and supply chains, so they won even when they were outnumbered. The Battle of Tannenberg was the first where Russia had lost to Germany and then withdrew. And they withdrew from the war at that point. We'll talk a lot more in the next video about the Russian Revolution, and you'll get a sense of that. So Germany was fighting a two-front war, the Western Front and the Eastern Front. And the Central Powers pushed Russia back. They captured Russian Poland, Lithuania, and most of Latvia and parts of Russian Ukraine. In 1916, it was a little bit better for the Russians. They had some better supplies, and they retook Galicia. And then in 1917, Russia, of course, pulls out of the war because of their own revolution. And in 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended the war in the Eastern Front and gave Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Ukraine their independence. Poland was not included in this, which caused riots and animosity of the Poles towards the Central Powers. Russians had lost a staggering 1.8 to 2.3 million soldiers in World War I, while Austria-Hungary and Germany lost approximately 3.2 million combined. So the other big thing that kind of happens in World War I is the war at sea. And you'll see here with battleships and, of course, submarines as well. So this is a newer part of World War I. Likewise is women's participation in the war. We tend to think of women as like working in the home front, particularly because of the World War II tropes, right? And, working in the factories. But in World War I, women were working quite a lot. They were working in the factories. They were serving as nurses on the front line and at home. And in Great Britain in particular, upper class women were opening their larger estates to make makeshift hospitals in the British countryside for veterans of the war. Women also worked as chimney sweeps, truck drivers, farm workers. 38% of workers in the German Krupp Armament Company were women. And there's a wonderful book called Not So Quiet, as a play on the words of All Quiet on the Western Front, that talks about British women nurses in World War I. I highly recommend it. It's a fascinating story of nurses and ambulance drivers. And it talks a lot about what they went through, but also how their perceptions of themselves and their peers and everything from their love lives to really who they were changed as a result of this work. So when we talk about the U.S. entering the war, the big factor that most people look at is the sinking of the Lusitania. This was a large ship that left the United States and was heading towards England. And Germany had actually put out a notice in the newspapers in New York City saying, hey, this ship will be targeted as we believe it is carrying war materials. And it won't be allowed to, enter the waters. So it was sunk, but it had American civilians on it, right? And Americans were very outraged by the end of this. Over 1,000 people died on the Lusitania. And this is, one of the major factors that brings the United States into World War One. World War One. Another major factor is that in 1917, a diplomatic proposal from the Germans to the Mexicans to form an alliance against the United States. Right? So this is Germany saying to Mexico, hey, like you should pair up with us in this war. And if the U.S. enters the war, then, you'll fight, Mexico will fight on the side of Germany, and we'll both fight the United States together. And if they win, then Mexico would gain Texas and other parts of the American Southwest back from the United States. And President Wilson armed American ships to defend against German subs as a result of this. And the news generated support for the U.S. declaration of war against Germany in April of 1917. The Zimmerman telegram was famously decoded, and this is what it looked like in code. I just give you that as an interest factor. Finally, when the war was over, the Treaty of Versailles was the peace treaty that was signed in Versailles outside of Paris. And the major European powers, along with the United States, attended the Versailles talks. Woodrow Wilson was there from the United States. He's the American president at the time. He brought with him his famous 14 points. I've got a link for it there. And we will be talking quite a lot about those 14 points in class because they really... this Congress of Vienna, the Treaty of Versailles is really sort of an end cap or a bookend to the Congress of Vienna. There's a lot that gets discussed, and the Congress, of course, is defining the terms of peace. Once again, the Europeans are doing that again. But they are going to be really blaming Germany for World War I as the belligerent nation. This is going to be a major, major cause of World War II. Of course, when Woodrow Wilson comes to Paris, he was welcomed as a hero. And here's a shot from the streets of Paris when he arrived. And here are 4 of the leaders of the major powers that were there at the Paris peace talks. David Lloyd George from England, Vittorio Orlando from Italy, George Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. That's from the left-hand side. So the Treaty of Versailles, as I said, made Germany guilty. This was called the War Guilt Clause. And they also said that reparations would be determined later on, that the amount of money that they would have to wait and see how much it would cost to rebuild France after the war, and that bill was going to go to Germany, essentially putting Germans in debt for future generations. They also demanded a major reduction in the German military and navy. They wanted Alsace and Lorraine to go back to France. If you remember, after the Franco-Prussian War, Alsace and Lorraine became German. And that area of the Rhine River became an occupied and demilitarized zone because that was such an industrial heartland at the time. So the major powers would jointly occupy that and make sure that Germany wasn't building up its arms. Also, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, Austria-Hungary loses a lot of its territory, and it's really sort of the beginning of the end for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So new countries get, like, for example, Czechoslovakia, right? And also Yugoslavia become countries along with Austria and Hungary. And then in the north, in the Baltics, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland finally does emerge as its own nation. The Ottoman Empire gets dismantled as well. But while allies promised Arab states independence from the Ottomans, France then takes control as sort of a colony, or what's called a protectorate at the time, of Lebanon and Syria, while Britain takes Iraq and Palestine as protectorates. And with this, as you can imagine, this newer version of colonialism is going to come with it a host of other difficulties. Also, the League of Nations gets established. This is the precursor to the United Nations. This was one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. the League did fail to keep the peace, and the United States actually voted to not join the League of Nations, but it is a precursor to the United Nations, which still exists today. So all in all, when we think about World War I, we've got the end of 4 major empires. We've got Germany as ending its colonial empire. States such as Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Yugoslavia gain their independence. And beginning with the breakup of the German Empire, this is really the start of decolonization that we will see come to a head after World War II. But it's the beginning of that, okay, because of the cost of war and the cost of colonial wars as well as European wars. But the British Empire, the British are starting to look at their empire as expensive and unnecessary. And France, of course, is absolutely devastated. When we talk about the interwar period in our next lessons, we'll be looking at the major loss of life, both land and people, for more than a generation. That this is the quote lost generation, and that the French have experienced. And of course, the British and the Germans also experienced a lot of loss. When we think about all that Western Front fighting that actually happened in France, the tangibility of it and the destruction to French land is quite tangible, right? Quantifiable. Also, World War I marked the end of the world order, that status quo that had been established at the Congress of Vienna. And as we move forward, we will see World War I as a cause of World War II. All right, stay tuned. Russian Revolution is next. Thank you.